Thank you, Dr. Gillespie, for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, James Weldon Johnson Institute, Emory University, for the invitation. Really glad to be here. It's kind of surreal. I haven't been in person in front of students in real life since March of 2020. So this is a bit of a coming back to glory sort of situation. And once again, just so happy to be here. I am going to talk about my book in the beginning, and then I'm going to try to align it with the interests and the aegis of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, the focus on race and difference. And then from that conversation, move towards some conversations around my upcoming and ongoing work. So I look forward to sharing this with you and hopefully thinking together. Unfortunately, I won't be able to sign books because the books aren't here. C'est la vie. So here we are. And the title of this presentation, From Social Death to Laboratory Life, Race, Diabetes, and the Science of Inclusion, draws from my book, Sweetness in the Blood, Race, Risk, and Type 2 Diabetes. And this project began originally as an investigation into type 2 diabetes as a lived experience among African Americans in the African American community. I wanted to engage the ways in which African Americans interacted with diabetes monitoring technologies, with the biomedical message. I wanted to understand the ways in which health literacy and cultural literacy create sometimes incommensurable and dissonant spaces, and the ways in which public health and genomics researchers seek to approach this population in order to create effective programs for diabetes education and treatment outreach. But as I began the project, I found that I needed to move from the ways in which a community interacts with the technologies to the ways in which diabetes as an industry has grown over the last 10 to 15 years, and the perennial role of African descent populations in bioscientific research, and how the mapping of the human genome and the mapping of the epigenome and genome of Henrietta Lacks' HeLa cells created new conversations and new spaces for this engagement. So the inspiration for my work began years ago in graduate school with Sidney Mintz's Sweetness and Power, a classic in anthropology, which looks at the ways in which sugar as a historical commodity, as an illness metaphor, African Americans tend to call diabetes sugar, how these things collide historically, epidemiologically, and socially through the mechanisms of capitalism, settler colonialism, and how African American labor figures into this historical amalgam of risk, speculation, profit, and loss. You may have seen the series. I don't know if you've read the book. I thoroughly suggest that you do if you haven't. Jennifer Bazile's Queen Sugar. I wanted to bring a gendered perspective to this whole sugar industrial complex, because at its base, it's a patriarchal, raced enterprise which obfuscates the forms of African descent experience, knowledge, and labor that have gone into this sugar enterprise, which has, as Sidney Mintz argues, changed metabolic destinies in the North and in the South, and as we'll discuss later, how it's become global as a form of risk, particularly since the pandemic. So in the book, I begin in Southwest Louisiana, deep in the bayou, where my mother's family comes from. where they used to cut sugar cane for 25 cents a ton with no AC, and how this history transcends national borders and national narratives and disciplinary preoccupations that wrap themselves around flags and nation states, and how those narratives are often appropriated by nation states. To argue for a diasporic understanding of this enterprise, of the circulation of capital, of people, of expertise. And in New Iberia, Louisiana, there's a plaque in the Vieux Carré, in the town square, outside the main library, dedicated to a woman named Félicité from Haiti, who in the 1830s in the 1820s, became well known and loved for her ability to heal the sick during a terrible yellow fever epidemic, which periodically descended upon South Louisiana, and to bring back this notion, this idea, this history of the relationship between the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Southern United States writ large. Julius Scott wrote a book called The Common Wind, which was recently published. Another book that is highly recommended, talks about these discourses, these hidden conversations, which the archive tends to have let go missing. These conversations around the Haitian Revolution and its effects throughout the hemisphere, not just in Lafayette, Louisiana, and New Orleans, but also in Philadelphia, South Carolina, and how those narratives of rebellion, those diasporic conversations that traveled among the enslaved Africans, the threats that they posed and the ways in which they were countered by various hegemonic forces. So I wanted to create a narrative. I wanted to write a narrative that transcended national boundaries, because diabetes itself has no boundaries. As we know during this pandemic, viruses have no boundaries. And to bring this point home, I was looking at the ways in which sugar as a drug over the course of the 19th and early 20th century was increasingly refined to what we know as white sugar, 99% sucrose. Sidney Menson's Sweetness and Power talks about brown sugar, the type that you can see in some Latin American, Mexican groceries. It's called canela, hard brown sugar. It has all of the hemoglobin, all of the trace minerals, very nutritious. But we all have developed a taste, all of us, most of us, for white sugar and the sorts of sensations and forms of affect, biological and aesthetic, that it produces as an ongoing form of colonization in a way. So I'm writing an article called Decolonizing the Palate. Everyone's talking about decolonizing this, decolonizing that, but then we go out to eat and we betray the entire project. So this is an article that I'm working on, and after the book, I now have more time to devote to it. But what I'm looking at here, Southwest Louisiana has a sugar festival every year, and a king and a queen are selected, always white. The man, the king, is usually a middle-aged member of the plantocracy, and the queen is usually a young college student of reproductive age. Who assumes the crown. What I didn't show here is a picture of her first maid. Her first maid is a Black woman, a young Black woman, right? So for me, and for the people of Southwest Louisiana, the African American community there refused to be ignored, and they created their own festival, the Brown Sugar Festival. More nutritious, I dare say. And some members of my family actually competed in this contest, and one of them actually won. She now lives in exile in Los Angeles. But she was proud of her participation in this. But as I discuss in the book, once people began to open up to the opportunities away from the sugarcane fields, in the oil industry, in the promised land called Houston, Texas, and in California as well, people began to leave the area. The Brown Sugar Festival was discontinued. But the point was made. We will not be excluded from the history. Those archival absences that Saadia Hartman writes about in her book, Losing Your Mother, right? So refusing to be left out of the pages of history, the Brown Sugar Festival sought to make a statement, which it did. But as I also said, due to what Isabel Wilkerson calls the Great Migration, many of these people left the area and moved elsewhere. But the point was made. In terms of our conversation, the leitmotif of Sweetness and Power, engraved by William Blake, is entitled Europe, Supported by Africa in America. And you can see the gold bars around the upper arms of America and Africa, signifying their bondage, joined together by a long rope of tobacco, looking out straight ahead for whatever dangers may be awaiting America in the new environment, making sure that she is supported and cared for on her journey. What I'm arguing in my book is that this is also something that we can look at in terms of a certain metabolic history that I'm going to relate sooner on. Because for me, I'm intrigued with the notion of exchange, gift exchange, as citizens, as gendered people, as minoritized populations. What are our obligations to each other, to the state, to science, to the world? I think the pandemic, as well as the political situation in this country, has raised many issues and provided many examples. I think for all of us, we could agree, as to what exactly constitutes the social contract and what are our obligations, one to the other. Numerous theorists have tackled this issue of exchange, most notably Marcel Mauss in his thin volume, The Gift. And on pages 82 and 83 of The Gift, Marcel Mauss makes it very clear that the test of any democratic society is when it's able to move from sacrificial exchange to egalitarian exchange. But what we have here in this painting of J. Marion Sims, the infamous father of gynecology, who I guess can be thanked for inventing the speculum, was his experiments on the enslaved African woman, Anarcha. Over a dozen experiments conducted without anesthesia. Raising this question, this perennial question, as to what are the conditions, what are the obligations of exchange, of participation, what does inclusion look like, what are the bioethical and gendered and raced aspects, components of this exchange. And in anthropology, Malinowski argued that exchange was political, that it moved cyclically and in circles throughout society, kind of, in a sense, latches on to Foucault's notion of power, in that power is not a top-down thing. Power circulates through all of us, and we reproduce it in our words, our thoughts, our deeds. So Marcel Mauss in 1923, after Malinowski, argued that exchange is social. It's something that we do in relation to each other. But Du Bois more pointedly argued, no. For African Americans, exchange is the gift of our racialized labor to the nation. Watching college football on Saturday reminded me of that. and the new forms of biocapital that this racialized labor produces. Football, one of my last remaining vices. It's hard to watch, understanding this, but I still watch. So, Levi-Strauss in '69, Gail Rubin and Jones Scott brought a gendered analysis to exchange theory, arguing that exchange of women as reproductive value generators in patriarchal, kinship, political, and economic structures and systems warrants further attention, actually primary attention, and that's the attention that I give in my work here. I move from race to gender to argue that we cannot understand race without first understanding gender. Mitchell and Walby coined the term biovalue about the ways in which biospecimens inhere a certain amount of value and create value, generate value, particularly of racial and gendered others in bioscientific research. But Richard Hyland completely turned the social scientific study of gift exchange on its head by arguing that exchange is so deeply rooted into culture that it precedes both the law and the economy. So a fundamental tension exists, therefore, between obligations to participate versus obligations to reciprocate. So I have some questions here, not complete, but hopefully provocative sufficiently for our conversation. Anna Marie Moe asks all of us, how does the category to which you belong care for you? What has it done? What does it do? I just published an article called The Case of Sparkle Rye, a study, a violent patriarchal narrative of race and conspiratorial kinship, in which I look at the ways in which kinship produces sometimes violent outcomes based on the ways in which families are formed, wealth is inherited, and how it gets policed in various ways. So this is an article in which I look at caste and race. Almost all societies have caste, so there's no particular aspersions here on any particular group. But in that article, I argue that caste internalizes claims to privilege, but race externalizes claims to justice, and they work at opposite ends. And that when we analyze them, we need to look at them with these in mind. So then how might we better understand the gift as a gendered and racialized form of sacrificial exchange of one to another? And how do genomics push the notion of metabolic risk backwards into ancestral time, beyond race and races, and more centrally toward gender? And in what ways does genomic diversity raise novel and perennial bioethical questions about the recruitment of sub-Saharan biological labor? So with that in mind, these are the methods that I engaged in writing the book. The longue durée of research. I did interviews and participant observation at the Diabetes Education Center at the University of California, San Francisco, Clinical Research Center in upstate New York, where I grew up, where I know a lot of people with diabetes, as well as people who are doing research in the area. And one thing I learned very quickly is that there is no shortage of people who want to talk about diabetes. From 2009 to 2014, I did work in Alameda County. I felt, and I think, and I thought that diabetes is such a pervasive problem that the field work that I engaged had to be multi-sided. I had to study up, I had to study down, I had to study crossways, as Laura Nader consistently impressed upon me. And I also went to the research triangle in North Carolina, Duke and North Carolina, University of North Carolina, as well as health disparities workshops and conferences in Houston and in Washington, D.C. And archival research at Johns Hopkins, Harvard, as well as digital and social research, social media research. I've done more interviews than this, but for the book, I had 40 structured and 54 semi-structured interviews that I included in the work. So with that methodology, and with the writing of the book, particularly chapters 4 and 5, through the words of my interlocutors, I became quite taken with the term diversity science, and more broadly, the notion of diversity itself, which we'll talk about later. And in the book, I talk about the ways in which the HeLa cell from Henrietta Lacks continues to transgress the social, laboratory, and environmental boundaries that circumscribe the life of Henrietta Lacks. There's a wonderful film from 1999, I believe, called The Way of All Flesh by Adam Curtis. You can find it on YouTube. This was way before the book came out. There are interviews with some of Henrietta Lacks' direct descendants who have since passed. And it's a fascinating, fascinating film, which talks about the ways in which HeLa has been able to invade labs all around the world, create confusion concerning the biosamples that are used, and how this form of, let's just call it agency, has Henrietta, or the HeLa cell itself, moving into areas that transcend and go beyond the slave quarters in Virginia in which she was born, the colored ward of the hospital in which she was housed, and the ways in which she was treated and died. So this question of social life or social death in laboratory life draws upon Orlando Patterson's work, Bruno Latour and Woolgar, and it also draws from Saidiya Hartman, Mary Douglas, and Richard Hyland, and Agamben, to try to make legible the biosocial intersections of race, gender, and caste. I connect these theoretical orientations and historical narratives about purity, danger, bare life, and social death to tell a story about the way scientists and citizens view and seek to guard against contamination in their laboratories and societies. So I argue, to paraphrase Du Bois, that diversity is the problem of the 21st century. The complicated history of E.O. Wilson and his notion of sociobiology. Various people have written about it, including my colleague Monica McLemore, who has received death threats for her simple arguing that we need to stop looking at human groups in racialized and tribalized ways. As I argue in the book as well, we're arguing against this notion of ethnos, for the notion of, we're arguing for anthropos as opposed to ethnos. Stop looking at people as ethnically bounded. And why can't we look at people as a continuum of humanity, as anthropos? But one of my interlocutors boldly told me that diversity science is what the pharmaceutical industry is and needs to devote their resources and their efforts toward growing. And she made it clear that pharma is a reflection of whites. But our company, like the rest of the US, is realizing that we can't just focus on the majority population and those with power and money. We now have a scientific basis for overseas trials, and this is where genetics come in. We have to argue that different diseases originate in different ways in different people. This is a new way to look at diversity. Remember, we are all 99.72% the same. It's this 0.28% difference in human beings that is attracting all of this funding, all of this research, all of this investigations into SNPs and to alleles and locating areas of risk. But the NIH and the national academies is not interested in understanding the mechanisms by which these categories are created and lived. So there's a new panel that has been empowered with creating new racial categories for scientific research, for government-funded scientific research. But they've made it clear in our meetings that they will only discuss race and racial categories, but they will not discuss racism. So racism is off the charts, off the table, off the books, but we have to find new ways of categorizing people and filtering the science through it. And it's been very humbling to see esteemed social scientists shot down during panel discussions and being told that this is not within our purview. We don't think that it's materially important. We'll leave it to you social scientists to continue to generate anecdata, but we generate data. And we're going to generate that data and filter it through, as we've seen with the US Census, through new categories of race and difference and ethnicity. So sub-Saharan diversity. The open secret is that the greatest genomic or genetic diversity in the world is in sub-Saharan African populations. There is more genetic diversity in a village in Cameroon than there is in the rest of the world combined. And if everyone outside of sub-Saharan Africa disappeared tomorrow, there's still enough genetic diversity in sub-Saharan Africa to recreate the world all over again. So now we have a new rush to remap Africa, to connect, to collect, and I'm working with people in the Genomics Institute at UCSC who are aware of these histories and these legacies, to collect more sub-Saharan African DNA, to enroll, to fund, to support African researchers in collecting this DNA, who themselves are finding problems creating categories. Should they be ethno-linguistic? Should they be tribal? Can we biologize language and culture? Look around this room, all of us are speaking English. In a sense, that's the argument for anthropos, in a way. But the funders, the research paradigm, the imperative is a categorical imperative to bring Kant into the conversation. So a high percentage of European Y chromosomes exist in the African American population as a legacy of slavery. This makes mitochondrial DNA a better locus of study for searching for that sub-Saharan African DNA. When Henrietta Lacks's DNA was first discovered, no one knew who she was, where she was from. Researchers in India, as I was going through the archives, were saying, this is sub-Saharan African DNA. Even though she's admixed, aren't we all? All. Her mitochondrial DNA bore, and her X chromosomes bore the unmistakable signature of sub-Saharan African DNA. It's a circular, maternally derived genome. It performs no recombination, is traceable, and more copies of it are available for study. This is a great book to read. It's a great book to teach. Students love it. It's thick. It's a thick tome. But at the same time, it's a rich narrative. It brings history, sociology, African American studies, genomics, as well as a newfound awareness about what it means to participate, willingly or unwillingly, in forms of exchange, of gifting, of racialized labor to science, and to the nation. HeLa cells, you can do a search online. They're available everywhere. You can buy them in the Netherlands. You can buy them from Japan. You can buy them in almost every industrialized country in the West. You can buy HeLa cell hoop earrings. You can buy necklaces. It's become quite the industry, one which her family is slowly beginning to try to find ways to capitalize from. And as the book relates. As all of this biowealth was being accumulated by researchers and institutions over the last 60, 70 years, the family has become increasingly poorer and more enmeshed in poverty. What very few people know is that all of their DNA has been collected as well. So, in 2013, the epigenome and the genome of the HeLa cell was mapped for the first time. And this promised or threatened to change the ways in which we understood or understand human adaptation to environmental change. So when we think of transhumanists, or human beings moving around the world, out of Africa and throughout the world, a theory that some still contest, we as a species have had to become accustomed to new environments, new foods, new climates, and this metabolic adaptation is what the HeLa cell promised and still promises to avail researchers a brighter and larger window to study through. The family was alarmed. Within a week of this article's publication, Francis Collins and those at the NIH were alerted, and they held impromptu meetings, invited the family, invited members of the family to join the ethics board, which, as a gesture, might be expected and perhaps could be understood. But the scientific literacy and institutional and economic leverage in the family was non-existent. So the family now has taken over the annual Henrietta Lacks workshop at Johns Hopkins, and they're running it, and they're running their own. And they have spoken at over 200, 250 colleges and universities since the publication of the book to try to tell their story about their ancestor, about the ways in which they viewed the research that was conducted and its effects not only in society, but more pointedly to the family. So out of Africa, in the lab and in society. So HeLa tells a story of gender and of laboratory infiltration. The ways in which this particular event, this moment, has had wings, has had legs and wings. Because we have to remember, when George Guy had harvested these HeLa cells, he had been working for 10 to 15 years to try to find ways to make cancer cells viable in vitro. And in going through the records at Hopkins, I uncovered lists of chemicals that he ordered from different companies, trying to find the right mix, the right cocktail that would keep these cells alive. And literally, HeLa falls into his lap, and it changes history. It changes biological history. Cytology, or cell biology, was almost a dead subdiscipline before HeLa. It has since generated upwards of 80 to 90,000 research papers, paid many people quite handsomely, sent their kids to schools like this, and at the same time, the Lacks family continues to struggle, as do many other minoritized groups and families. So I'm arguing here that sub-Saharan DNA should not be othered as sub-Saharan. It should be seen as global DNA. What we have here is a situation where this othering proves less harmful than instructive. And by looking at it from a global perspective, it helps to caution us against the othering that can go on in looking at these groups. I say this because in an article that I wrote called Ennobling the Neanderthal, an article which takes to task the ways in which once researchers discovered that sub-Saharan African populations contain little to no Neanderthal DNA, all of a sudden the Neanderthal became this glorified, exalted subspecies, I'll call them that all of a sudden had some sort of salience for understanding difference. Before this discovery, the Neanderthal was seen as regressive, as a evolutionary failure, as a reminder of our brutish past. But now the Neanderthal in writings and in research all of a sudden has this ennobled status. And there is a diabetes research initiative called the SLIM Initiative in Mexico, funded by the billionaire Carlos Slim, which was looking at diabetes risk among people in Mexico. And it was argued through this research that Native American ingression into the settler colonial Mexican Spanish population created this increased risk for diabetes in the Mexican population, excuse me. But the cells that were used to make this analysis possible and its outcomes legible were HeLa cells. So as I argue in the article, somehow the researchers and the samples had to literally return to Africa in order to become legible and to create these notions of risk. So still we have people, if you ever dare go online, I recommend that you don't eat before you do, and after you do, take a shower. There are people in the physical anthropology and the biological anthropology community who, anonymized behind their computers, have all sorts of racist things to say about sub-Saharan African people, about sub-Saharan African notions of phenotypical behavior, and who reject the out of Africa hypothesis. So and this is very much prevalent in China as well, which wants to argue that Beijing man, as Homo erectus, is the original ancestor of the Han Chinese population. And that is where the biological history begins. But we also have people in Europe and in the United States who also reject the out of Africa hypothesis. Some informed or misinformed by religion and Noah's 4 sons. Others through a blatant refusal to recognize any sort of biological and historical or ancestral connection to Africa. So this notion of polygenesis and monogenesis is what we are thinking about here. So in a sense, this informs, in a real sense, ethno-racial nationalisms and the ongoing preoccupation with categorization, phenotypically. But HeLa is still causing problems. Christopher Korsch is uncovering the ways in which HeLa has made many genomic research studies invalid. People thought they were working with certain cell lines and they turned out to be HeLa cell lines. Upwards of 70,000 citations were generated from this work. $3.5 billion of funding have gone into this work. All of it down the toilet. And the ways in which HeLa works as an almost universal, if not global, lens onto examining this diversity and how it continues to insist itself upon science and upon those spaces which many in the social sciences of science and medicine argue are socially constructed. This takes us to Bruno Latour and the notion of laboratory life and the mutable mobiles. We find that still we have a problem, and that is diversity as a social problem. Purity and danger, drawing from Mary Douglas's work, which is a must-read as well in anthropology, and how immigration, particularly to Europe, but also into the US, is seen as a biosocial threat. We already have African Americans here, so that's enough to cause trouble. But Europe is facing a deluge of people from sub-Saharan Africa and, for lack of a better term, let's just say the Near East, who are, through various policies enacted by the hegemonic powers, forced to leave their homes and corrupt governments to seek a better life in the north, in El Norte. And the ways this is seen as a threat to national identity, to national culture, this is all happening within the midst of demographic collapse. It's a concern from Seattle to Siberia, from Germany to Japan. We are not reproducing ourselves enough to pay the taxes to support the elderly, and we are not reproducing ourselves sufficiently. Some will argue that they are not, or that they're being deluged by people who are reproducing faster than they are, and that they are the problem. And I think in terms of what we're seeing in our society, we need to pay close attention to this phenomenon. One, because politicians are aware of this. The business community is aware of this. The politicians use it for their advantage, to their advantage, hopefully. Whereas capitalists are keenly aware not only of the situation, but the need to continue to grow a base of customers, of people who are willing to participate in and contribute to the capital project of the nation state. So another reason why we need to pay attention to this is, while on the outside, at the surface level, race and ethnicity can be held up as the boogeyman, it also portends in the midst of demographic collapse. And the recent Supreme Court decision, it warrants a closer analysis, a vigilant analysis on the ways in which women and gender, from a gendered perspective, may get brought into this. I'm evoking my inner Margaret Atwood here, who I've talked to at length about this. And as you know, she's not much of an optimist about anything, particularly when it comes to the politics of gender, reproduction, and power. So, as they say, they came for me today and you said nothing. Tomorrow they will come for you. Quite possibly. So, purity and danger. The danger to purity. Notions of purity. Purity that does not exist in reality. And this is something that my colleagues at HBCUs have to deal with continually. They firmly believe in the scientific method as an avenue toward truth and understanding, but they are constantly enrolled, included in scientific projects because of their proximity to the African American population, wedded to this idea of race and categories. And as one interlocutor told me, science is the truth, but we're not being asked to do the science of truth. We're being asked to do the science of reality. And racial science is the science of reality, but it's not, in their eyes, the science of truth. But they're tethered in terms of resources and funding to institutions and to government agencies that continually require them to do research through the lens of race. So to argue against categories, to argue against these constructs, to argue for a more egalitarian way of understanding change in society, as Mintz would argue, and in bodies, I'd like to show you this graph. I'm drawing from Merrill Singer's notion of a syndemic. So I am expanding this singular focus on the pandemic to create a wider analytical and theoretical lens about what Singer calls a syndemic, which is a collision of social factors and biological factors that need to be considered when looking at any pandemic or form of, or any sort of viral epidemic. So for Singer's, in his original formulation, AIDS, urban violence, and drugs were part of a theoretical triangle that he used to argue that we need to look at all of these factors in understanding the HIV/AIDS epidemic. This was in the mid-90s. But what I'm arguing here is for a look at the pandemic, the current pandemic, as a syndemic that triangulates health disparities, the pandemic itself, and the pandemic, sorry, jet lag is just all over me. The pandemic, health disparities, and type 2 diabetes, particularly. So the American Psychological Association earlier this year, as part of their study entitled Stress in America, looked at the ways in which the syndemic has affected our metabolic lives in this country. And they found that 6 in 10 US adults report undesired weight change since the start of the pandemic. Yours truly included. And if you look closely at the graph, at these two graphs, almost by a factor of 2 to 1, people across categories report undesired weight gain. I think we can agree that the pandemic has changed the ways in which we eat, the ways in which we relate to food. I never did Grubhub and Uber Eats until this thing started. That's expensive. But it became logical, it became rational, it became a prophylactic way of avoiding the contagion. And across groups, US adults, average weight gain, 29 pounds, men, 37 pounds, women, 22 pounds, Gen Z, 28, millennials, 41 pounds, Generation Xers, 21 pounds, boomers, 16, older adults, almost negligible, because after age 75, it's kind of hard to put weight on. But across racial categories, remains the same pretty much. White adults, Black adults, Hispanic adults, a little less so, about the same. Asian adults, Asian, another category that is problematic, gained 12 pounds, but among the Asian population, for example, weight gain and abdominal adiposity are not seen as risk factors for type 2 diabetes. You can be slim, 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 and you can still have a very high type 2 diabetes risk. This is especially true among South Asian populations. Essential workers, people on the front lines, 38 pounds. Parents, 36 pounds. So across the board, across categories of risk, we see how the pandemic has affected most, if not all, groups. Maybe not equally, but substantially. And part of my ongoing work is going to track and follow what that means for our metabolic future in this country and around the world, but more pointedly in the United States. How many of you have seen this sugar sculpture? I wanted this to be the cover of my book. The publisher said no. Kara Walker just claimed copyright and intellectual property rights, and she said no. Not me, I'm with your publisher here. She said, Any way to bring that back up?
Yeah, gotta let it cool down.
It's gotta let it cool down, or else the sugar's going to melt. So Kara Walker's sugar sculpture, the Domino Sugar Factory in New York, is called a subtlety, a not too subtle subtlety. And it illustrates what we've been talking about here, this notion of purity, of danger, of gender, of the erasure of Black women and African Americans, more broadly from this conversation about how this nation was built, how sugar became king, how sugar changed the nutritional destinies of people in the North and the South. And I don't know, those of you who have seen it, have you seen it from all angles? Okay. So this reproductive, this inherent reproductive biology of race and capital production and profits and speculation, the reproduction of race, the purification of sugar into something white and pure on the backs of enslaved Africans in the United States, Jamaica, Martinique, Trinidad, Guyana, and other places, tells a history largely unwritten and untold in the archives, and one that compels us all to think more broadly and more deeply about what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be related? What does it mean to break bread together? What does it mean to live within categories which have no biological basis in fact, but which serve to reproduce the very types of artifact and affect that the sugar enterprise has created. So, oh wow, let's go back then. So this is the sugar sphinx. And there's a side view and there's a rear view. The rear view shows her backside lifted up, her vagina visibly present as a symbol of this generative, reproductive capacity to recreate biologized, racialized forms of labor. And perhaps the sugar sculpture itself, as an evolute of a certain type of purity, is having the final revenge on all of us. And how we need to think more deeply about the ways in which we feed ourselves, the ways in which culture gets reproduced and power gets reproduced uncritically. I'm somewhat in despair about this because when I go home and I'm with the family, they don't want to hear it. You've read too many books. You live in California. You want us to eat like white people. Some of y'all know what I'm talking about. So, implications and takeaways on a more hopeful note. Scientific and social thinking and practices frame diversity categorically, not as a dynamic state of nature. New narratives of diversity drive strategies of racial inclusion and health disparities in genomic research. Sacrificial exchange challenges efforts toward gaining trust and makes difficult achieving social and medical justice goals. We are pushed to think more broadly and deeply about the ways race and gender each persist as afterlives, to quote Hartman, within histories of sacrificial exchange that culturally reproduce obligations to give without obligations to reciprocate. And to keep our eyes on the ways in which the research desire for diversity exists in contradistinction and in tension with ethno-nationalist apprehension about diversity itself, and how diversity itself forms part of a discursive shift from race, and how that shift in conversation, one that universities all around this country are wholly invested in, how it obscures larger issues around justice. So this is my book project, Laboratory Life and Social Death, The Problem of Diversity in Science and Society. I'm also writing an article which is more of a spree sort of liberation, like I want to write something different thing. And I'm writing an article about Frederick Douglass and his exchange, his encounter with Sandy Jenkins. If you remember the autobiography of Frederick Douglass, and Sandy Jenkins gives him this root, which he says, no white man will harm you as long as you keep this root on your body. And I'm looking at those moments of exchange between those silences in the pages, between Douglass and Jenkins, and Douglass's motivation for including Jenkins in his narrative, despite the fact that the root did help him avoid the vicious beating from Covey, but once he was liberated and freed and writing for a wider public, he re-embraced his Enlightenment moorings and called Jenkins and other slaves who practiced these forms of botanical liberational practice superstitious and ignorant slaves. So trying to think about that moment of exchange. I'm also writing slowly a social history of the National Human Genome Center at Howard University, Dr. Georgia Dunstan, and an article called HeLa and the Challenges of Research Reproducibility, a problem that I've alluded to in this talk. Acknowledgements, and thank you.